October 15, 1945. A transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Concordia in Kansas, carrying 37 German prisoners of war who had crossed the Atlantic, expecting the worst. They had heard stories during their final days in Europe, whispered warnings from other captured soldiers about American brutality, about prison camps where men were worked to death or left to starve. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Schneider sat in the back of the truck, his uniform still bearing the dust of his capture 3 weeks earlier in Bavaria. At 32 years old, he had survived 5 years of war, from the invasion of Poland to the desperate final defense of the fatherland. Now, gazing through the canvas opening at the flat Kansas landscape, he steeled himself for whatever punishment awaited him in this strange, vast country that had helped destroy everything he once knew. The truck stopped outside a series of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. American guards, looking impossibly young and well-fed in their crisp uniforms, gestured for the prisoners to disembark. Klaus noticed immediately that none of the guards carried their rifles with particular menace. There was no shouting, no rough handling as the exhausted Germans climbed down from the truck bed. Instead, one guard, a freckled kid who looked barely 20, smiled slightly and said something in English that Klaus couldn't understand. The prisoners were led into a processing building where they surrendered what few personal items they still possessed. Klaus handed over a bent photograph of his wife Maria and his 2 daughters, along with a small prayer book his mother had given him before the war. The American sergeant carefully logged each item and promised in broken German that everything would be kept safe and returned when appropriate. Then came the moment that would define everything Klaus thought he knew about his captors. The prisoners were led to a mess hall where long tables had been, set with metal trays. The smell hit them first, a sweet, rich aroma of fried dough and sugar that seemed impossibly out of place in a prison camp. On each tray sat a peculiar ring-shaped pastry, golden brown and glistening with what appeared to be honey or sugar glaze. Next to it, a cup of dark coffee steamed in the cool October morning. Klaus stood frozen, staring at the tray before him. Around him, other prisoners exchanged confused glances. Was this some kind of test? A cruel joke before the real deprivation began? The young freckled guard walked along the tables, gesturing to the pastries and repeating a word in English that sounded like donut. He mimed eating, smiled encouragingly, and said something else that Klaus's limited English couldn't decipher. But the meaning was clear enough. This sweet, cake-like thing was their breakfast. The Americans expected them to eat dessert at the start of the day. Klaus Schneider had not eaten a proper meal in 6 weeks. The final months of the war had reduced the Wehrmacht's rations to a grim lottery of survival. Sometimes there was bread so hard it had to be soaked in water before chewing. Other times, a thin soup made from potato peels and whatever the cooks could scavenge from abandoned farms. On good days, perhaps a small portion of ersatz sausage that tasted more of sawdust than meat. He remembered the last real cake he had eaten, a small slice of his daughter Anna's birthday torte in early 1944, before the Allied bombing intensified and sugar became impossible to find. His wife Maria had saved ration coupons for months to make that cake, sacrificing butter and eggs that the family desperately needed. Anna had been 6 years old then, her eyes wide with wonder at the rare treat. Klaus wondered if she even remembered what cake tasted like now. The other prisoners in the truck shared similar memories of deprivation. Werner Koch, a 24-year-old private from Dresden, spoke quietly about watching his city burn from his position on the Eastern Front. He had received a letter from his mother in March describing how they ate grass soup and considered themselves lucky when they found a rat in the cellar. Helmut Braun, at 41 the oldest among them, had been a baker in Hamburg before the war. He described how his profession had become a source of shame rather than pride as the years progressed, as he was forced to create bread from chestnuts, acorns, and sawdust mixed with whatever grain the authorities allocated. The memory of real flour, real yeast, real butter, had become almost painful to him. During their journey across the Atlantic, packed in the hold of a Liberty ship, the prisoners had received their first taste of American rations: canned meat that was actually meat, white bread that was soft and fresh, chocolate bars distributed casually as if they were nothing special. The German prisoners had eaten slowly, almost reverently, unable to believe that such food was standard issue for common soldiers. Some had saved portions, hoarding them like treasures, unable to trust that more would come. Klaus had watched American sailors throw away half-eaten sandwiches, toss aside partially full cans, and waste food with a casualness that seemed obscene to men who had watched their countrymen starve. The propaganda they had been fed during the war spoke of American degeneracy and weakness, of a soft people who knew nothing of real sacrifice. But the evidence before their eyes told a different story. These Americans had food to waste while Germany's children picked through rubble for scraps. They had chocolate to hand out carelessly while Wehrmacht soldiers fought on empty stomachs. As the truck had carried them through the Kansas countryside, Klaus had seen farms bursting with harvest, silos full of grain, cattle grazing in endless fields. The abundance was staggering, incomprehensible, and deeply unsettling to men who came from a land of ruins and hunger. The morning of October 16th began with confusion. Klaus had barely slept in the barracks, his mind racing with uncertainty about what the next day would bring. He had expected wake-up calls barked by harsh guards, perhaps harsh labor assignments or interrogations. Instead, he woke to the sound of American popular music playing from a radio somewhere outside, and the gentle murmur of guards talking casually amongst themselves. The other prisoners stirred slowly, exchanging uncertain glances. Werner Koch sat on the edge of his bunk, rubbing his eyes and trying to make sense of their surroundings in the pale morning light. The barracks were simple but clean, with real mattresses on the bunks and wool blankets that smelled of fresh laundry rather than mildew and sweat. Then the smell began drifting through the windows. At first, Klaus thought he was imagining it, that his exhausted mind was conjuring phantom memories of better times. But the aroma grew stronger, unmistakable. Frying dough, sugar, cinnamon, the rich smell of real coffee, not the bitter acorn substitute they had choked down during the war's final months. Helmut Braun, the former baker, stood and walked to the window, breathing deeply. His eyes closed, and for a moment his face held an expression of such longing that Klaus had to look away. "That is real baking," Helmut whispered in German. "That is butter, real sugar. My God, I have not smelled anything like that in 4 years." An American guard appeared at the barracks door, the same freckled young soldier from the previous evening. He called out something in English, gesturing for them to follow. The prisoners filed out slowly, still expecting some catch, some revelation that the smells were meant to torment rather than nourish them. They walked across the compound to a long wooden building marked with a sign Klaus could not read. Inside, the mess hall was already filled with other prisoners who had arrived in earlier transports. These men sat at tables eating, actually eating, with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching guilty pleasure. The serving line moved efficiently. American cooks, including one large black man whose easy smile seemed impossible in a place of captivity, handed out trays with practiced efficiency. When Klaus reached the front of the line, he was given a metal tray containing items that seemed to exist in defiance of everything he understood about war and imprisonment. 2 of the ring-shaped pastries, still warm to the touch and glazed with sugar that caught the overhead lights. A cup of coffee so dark and rich that steam rose from it in visible curls. 3 strips of crispy bacon. 2 eggs fried in real butter. A small glass of orange juice that looked impossibly bright and fresh. Klaus carried his tray to a table and sat down, staring at the food before him. Around him, other prisoners ate slowly, some with tears running down their faces, others in complete silence, as if afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had produced this impossible bounty. Klaus picked up one of the ring-shaped pastries, turning it slowly in his hands. The glaze left a sticky sweetness on his fingers, and the dough still held warmth from the fryer. He brought it closer to his face, inhaling the scent of vanilla and sugar. Across from him, Werner Koch held his own pastry, but had not yet taken a bite. The young private's face showed the same conflict that Klaus felt churning in his stomach. This was wrong somehow. This sweetness, this abundance, this casual offering of what should be a rare delicacy, as if it were ordinary breakfast fare. "It could be poisoned," whispered Friedrich Vogel, a thin corporal from Stuttgart who sat to Klaus's left. "Why else would they feed us like this? They are fattening us up for something, or perhaps this is meant to make us sick, to humiliate us." But even as Friedrich spoke, his eyes remained fixed on the golden pastry before him, and his words carried no conviction. Helmut Braun, the baker, had already taken a bite of his. Tears ran freely down his weathered face as he chewed slowly, savoring every morsel. "It is real," he said softly in German. "Flour, eggs, butter, yeast. This is made with real ingredients, proper ingredients. The glaze is pure sugar with vanilla, nothing artificial, nothing ersatz." He took another bite, and his shoulders shook with emotion he could no longer contain. "I have not tasted anything this good since 1939. Klaus watched other prisoners around the mess hall. Some ate ravenously, as if afraid the food might disappear. Others ate with careful deliberation, making each bite last as long as possible. A few still had not touched their trays, sitting frozen in some internal debate about acceptance and surrender. The American guards moved through the room, refilling coffee cups and gesturing to the serving line where more food remained. One guard, an older man with gray at his temples, approached a table where 3 prisoners sat motionless before their meals. He said something in English that Klaus couldn't fully understand, but the tone was gentle, encouraging. When the prisoners still hesitated, the guard picked up one of the pastries from his own plate, took a large bite, and smiled. "Donut," he said clearly, pointing to the pastries. "Good. Eat." He patted his own stomach and made an exaggerated expression of satisfaction. Klaus made his decision. He bit into the pastry, and the taste that filled his mouth was a revelation that transcended food. The dough was light and airy, not dense or heavy. The glaze provided sweetness without being cloying. There was a hint of nutmeg in the dough itself, a complexity that spoke of abundance rather than scarcity. He chewed slowly, and with each bite, something shifted inside him. This was not the food of captors who viewed their prisoners with contempt. This was not a ration designed merely to keep men alive for labor. This was food made with care, with pride, with an assumption that even enemy soldiers deserved to eat well. Klaus swallowed, and felt his carefully constructed expectations about American cruelty begin to crumble like the tender pastry in his hands. Private Eddie Walsh stood behind the serving counter, watching the German prisoners eat his donuts with an expression caught somewhere between pride and concern. At 23 years old, Eddie had been making donuts since he was 14, working in his uncle's bakery in Brooklyn before the war. When the army discovered his skills, they had assigned him to food services rather than the infantry, a posting that had saved his life while making him feel perpetually guilty. He had wanted to fight, to prove himself like his older brother Tommy, who had died at Normandy. Instead, he fought his war with flour and sugar, feeding troops who would go on to the real battles. But watching these German prisoners eat, Eddie began to understand that maybe his war mattered too. The freckled guard, Corporal Jimmy Peterson from Minnesota, had told him about the condition of the prisoners when they arrived. Malnourished, hollow-eyed, expecting brutality, Eddie had stayed up most of the night before their first breakfast, making batch after batch of donuts, determined that they would be perfect. Not because regulations required it, but because something in him insisted that food should be made with dignity, regardless of who would eat it. Klaus finished his first donut and found himself reaching for the second, even as his mind rebelled against the action. He caught the eye of the large black cook who had served him, and the man smiled broadly, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Klaus had never interacted with a black person before. Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of racial inferiors, of primitive people. Yet here was this man, clearly skilled at his craft, taking obvious pride in his work, treating German prisoners with more kindness than Klaus had shown many people in his own country. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Corporal Peterson approached Klaus's table carrying a pot of fresh coffee. "More?" he asked, gesturing to Klaus's empty cup. His German was minimal, but the intent was clear. Klaus nodded, unable to quite find words even in his own language. As Peterson poured, he spoke slowly in English, using simple words and hand gestures. "Donut," he said, pointing to the pastries. "American breakfast. Every day." He made a circular gesture indicating repetition, routine. "Every day, we eat donuts. Normal." Klaus stared at him, trying to process this information. Every day? This abundance, this sweetness, was not a special occasion or a trick. It was simply how Americans began their mornings. Peterson seemed to understand Klaus's confusion. He pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket, showing a diner back in Minnesota. He pointed to a display case in the photo, filled with rows of donuts. "Home," he said, "my town." Every morning. He mimicked people eating, drinking coffee, reading newspapers, normal life. Werner Koch leaned forward, his limited English better than Klaus's. "Every day?" he asked carefully in English. "You eat cake every morning?" Peterson laughed, not mockingly but with genuine amusement at the description. "Donut," he corrected gently. "Not cake. Donut is different." But he seemed to realize that to these starving men from a destroyed country, the distinction was meaningless. "Yes," he finally said, "every day. This is America." That evening, Klaus sat on his bunk with a pencil and paper that the camp authorities had provided. The Red Cross had informed them they could write letters home, though delivery was uncertain given the chaos in occupied Germany. Klaus stared at the blank page, trying to find words that would make sense to Maria, to his daughters, to anyone who remained in Hamburg. How could he explain what he had experienced that morning? How could he describe eating glazed pastries and fresh eggs while his family likely scavenged for potato peels in the rubble of their city? He began writing several times, each attempt ending in frustrated scribbles. "Dear Maria, today the Americans gave us cake for breakfast." He crossed it out immediately. It sounded absurd, almost insulting. His wife was probably going hungry, and here he was writing about cake. "My dearest wife, you would not believe how they feed us here." Also wrong. That sounded like boasting, like he had forgotten their suffering while he enjoyed enemy hospitality. Werner Koch sat nearby, facing the same struggle. He had written 3 words, "Dear Mama, before stopping completely. "How can I tell her?" Werner asked quietly in German. "How can I tell her that I ate better today than I have in 2 years, while she wrote me last month about eating grass and dandelions?" His voice carried guilt so heavy that several other prisoners looked up from their own attempted letters. Helmut Braun, the baker, had managed to write more than the others. His letter described the donuts in technical terms, baker to baker, as if documenting a recipe rather than confronting the moral complexity of their situation. "The dough is enriched with eggs and butter," he wrote to his wife who had worked alongside him in their Hamburg bakery. "The glaze is a simple mixture of powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla. Nothing we could not have made ourselves before the war, when such ingredients existed in our country. The Americans make these every day, Liebling. Every single day. They have so much flour and sugar that they can afford to fry dough in oil and coat it with pure sugar for ordinary breakfast. What does this say about the country we fought? What does it say about the lies we were told?" Klaus finally managed to write a letter, though it was careful and incomplete. He told Maria he was safe, that he was being treated well, that the food was adequate. He asked about the girls, about their home, about which neighbors had survived. He told her he loved her and missed her desperately, but he did not mention the donuts. He could not. Some truths were too complicated to put on paper, too laden with shame and confusion to send across the ocean to people who were suffering in ways he could now barely comprehend. He sealed the letter knowing it was a lie of omission, but unsure what truth would serve anyone better. Around him in the barracks, other prisoners wrestled with the same impossible task of explaining the inexplicable to those who would never understand. Private Eddie Walsh arrived at the camp kitchen at 4 o'clock every morning, 2 hours before the rest of the food service staff. This was his sanctuary, his place of purpose in a war that had largely passed him by. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting smells of yeast and flour, a world away from the battlefields where his brother had died. He moved through his routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been baking since childhood, measuring ingredients by instinct as much as by sight. The donut recipe he used was his Uncle Sal's, brought over from Sicily and adapted through generations of Walsh family bakers in Brooklyn. Eddie knew it by heart. 20 pounds of flour, 6 pounds of sugar, 3 dozen eggs, 2 pounds of butter, salt, nutmeg, vanilla, and yeast that he nurtured like a living thing. The dough had to be mixed just right, not too much or the donuts would be tough, not too little or they would fall apart in the fryer. He shaped each one by hand, his fingers working automatically while his mind wandered. Lately, Eddie had been thinking about the German prisoners. He had watched them in the mess hall, seen the disbelief and confusion on their faces. Corporal Peterson had translated some of their conversations, and Eddie had learned that many of them were men not unlike himself, workers, fathers, sons who had been swept up in something larger than they understood. Helmut Braun, the former baker, had particularly caught Eddie's attention. The way the old German had examined the donuts, the tears in his eyes, the reverence with which he ate them, that was the look of someone who understood craft, who appreciated the care that went into making something well. On the morning of October 19th, Eddie made a decision. When the prisoners came through the serving line, he watched for Helmut. The German baker came through with his usual quiet dignity, accepting his tray with a nod of thanks. Eddie gestured for him to wait, then held up a fresh donut, still warm from the fryer. He pointed to Helmut, then to himself, then made a gesture of working together. Helmut's eyes widened with understanding and uncertainty. Eddie looked around for Corporal Peterson, who hurried over to translate. "Private Walsh wants to know if you would like to help him bake," Peterson said in his careful German. "He knows you were a baker before the war. He could use the help, and he thought you might enjoy the work." Helmut stood frozen, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. To bake again, to work with real ingredients, to create, rather than simply consume. But could he? Should he? Would helping the Americans make food be a betrayal of his starving countrymen? Eddie seemed to sense the internal struggle. He said something in English that Peterson translated. He says that baking is not about politics or countries, it is about feeding people. That is all it has ever been about. Helmut looked at the young American, saw the genuine invitation in his eyes, and slowly nodded. "Ja," he said quietly. "Yes, I would like that very much." Klaus lay awake that night, his stomach pleasantly full for the first time in months, and the guilt gnawed at him worse than hunger ever had. He thought about the winter of 1944, when his unit had been stationed outside of Bastogne. They had received a Christmas ration that year, a small tin of meat paste, a few hard crackers, and a single piece of chocolate that was mostly wax and cocoa powder. The men had treated those rations like treasure, rationing the chocolate into tiny portions that lasted for days. They had thought themselves fortunate compared to the units on the Eastern Front, where soldiers reportedly ate bark and boiled leather when supplies failed to arrive. He remembered a young private named Johann Müller, barely 18 years old, who had collapsed during a march in February. When the medic examined him, they found his pockets stuffed with grass and tree bark he had been eating to quiet his cramping stomach. Johann had been so ashamed, as if hunger were a personal failure rather than a systematic collapse of supply lines. Klaus had given the boy half of his own meager ration that day, watching him eat with the desperate urgency of someone who could not remember what it felt like to be satisfied. Now, Klaus had eaten 2 donuts, bacon, eggs, and orange juice for breakfast. For lunch, there had been roast beef sandwiches on soft white bread, with real butter and mustard. An apple for dessert, crisp and sweet. For dinner, fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and another donut with coffee. In one day, he had consumed more food than some weeks during the final months of the war. And tomorrow, the Americans assured them, there would be more. The same abundance, day after day, as if scarcity were not the natural state of existence. Werner Koch had been writing calculations on a scrap of paper, trying to quantify their rations in terms they could understand. "I estimate," he said quietly to Klaus in the darkness of the barracks, "that we each received approximately 3,000 calories today, maybe more. During the last month before our capture, we were lucky to get 800 calories a day, often less." He paused, and Klaus could hear the tremor in his voice. "My mother wrote that she and my sister were sharing 1 potato per day, 1 potato between 2 people, and we are eating fried chicken." Friedrich Vogel spoke from his bunk across the room. "My brother was killed at Stalingrad." In his last letter, he wrote about soldiers fighting over a dead horse, cutting pieces from it with their bayonets, eating the meat raw because they had no fuel to cook it. He wrote that hunger was worse than the Russian bullets, that it drove men mad. Friedrich's voice broke. "And we are being given cake for breakfast. By the enemy. The people we tried to destroy are feeding us better than our own army ever did." The barracks fell silent, except for the sound of men struggling with thoughts too heavy for words. Outside, somewhere in the Kansas night, Klaus could hear American guards laughing about something, their voices easy and unconcerned. The fourth morning began like the others, with the smell of fresh donuts drifting through the camp. Klaus dressed slowly, his movements mechanical. Each morning the routine became more familiar, and with familiarity came a deepening sense of wrongness that he could not shake. He was adapting to abundance while his family remained in ruins. He was accepting kindness from the enemy while his countrymen suffered under occupation. He was eating donuts while children in Hamburg starved. At breakfast, Klaus took his tray and sat in his usual spot. The donut before him looked identical to those from previous days, golden and perfectly glazed, but today he could not bring himself to take the first bite. He stared at it, seeing instead his daughter Anna's thin face from the last photograph Maria had sent him in early 1945. Anna had looked gaunt even then, her cheeks hollow, her eyes too large for her small face. What did she look like now? Was she even alive? Helmut Brown entered the mess hall from the kitchen, wearing a white apron dusted with flour. He had been baking with Private Walsh since yesterday, and despite everything, there was a lightness in his step that had not been there before. He was doing what he loved, working with real ingredients, creating something beautiful. But when he sat down across from Klaus, he too seemed unable to eat. "I made those this morning," Helmut said quietly in German, gesturing to the donuts. "Eddie, the American, he let me shape them, glaze them. It felt good to bake again, Klaus. It felt right." He paused, picking up his own donut and turning it slowly. "But then I thought about my wife, about how she had to close our bakery because there was no flour to be had, about how she probably has not tasted real bread in over a year. And here I am, making pastries for prisoners, making them for myself." Werner Koch joined them, his face drawn and pale. "I cannot do this anymore," he said. "I cannot sit here eating like a king while my mother eats dandelions. It feels like betrayal. Every bite feels like I am abandoning them." Klaus understood exactly what Werner meant. The food was not just sustenance, it was a barrier being built between them and the people they had left behind. With each meal, they were becoming different from those who suffered in Germany. They were becoming prisoners who ate well, who slept on real mattresses, who drank real coffee. How could they ever explain this to those who had endured the bombing, the starvation, the complete collapse of everything they knew? "But we must eat," Helmut said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Starving ourselves here does not feed them there. It accomplishes nothing except making us weak." He was right, Klaus knew. Refusing the food would not help Maria or Anna or anyone else. It would be an empty gesture, a performance of suffering that served no purpose. And yet eating felt like acceptance, like surrender, like choosing comfort over solidarity with those who had none. Klaus picked up the donut and took a bite, tasting guilt more than sugar. Private Eddie Walsh noticed the change in the German prisoners. The initial wonder had faded, replaced by something darker that he recognized from his own struggles with survivor's guilt. His brother Tommy had died on a beach in France, while Eddie made donuts in Kansas. He knew what it felt like to be safe while others suffered. On the morning of October 23rd, Eddie decided to do something about it. He asked Corporal Peterson to gather a small group of prisoners in the kitchen after breakfast, those who had shown interest in the baking process. Klaus came reluctantly, more out of respect for Helmut than genuine interest. Werner and Friedrich joined them, along with 3 other prisoners. Eddie stood at the large wooden work table, flour dusting his hands, and began to speak through Peterson's translations. "I want to teach you how to make donuts," Eddie said. "Not just watch, but actually make them yourselves. I figure if you are going to eat them every day, you might as well understand what goes into them." He gestured for them to gather around the mixing bowl. "My Uncle Sal used to say that baking is honest work. You put good ingredients in, you get good bread out. You try to cheat, to use bad flour or skip steps, the bread knows. It will not lie for you." He began measuring flour, explaining each step through Peterson's careful translations. Klaus found himself drawn into the process despite his resistance. There was something meditative about the precise measurements, the careful mixing, the transformation of simple ingredients into something greater than their parts. Eddie handed the wooden spoon to Helmut, who took it with hands that trembled slightly. The German baker began to mix, and his movements carried decades of muscle memory. Eddie watched with approval, then made a small correction to Helmut's technique. showing him the American method that was slightly different from the German approach. They mixed together, two bakers separated by language and history, united by flour and yeast. As the dough came together, Eddie began to talk about his family. Through Peterson, he told them about his uncle's bakery in Brooklyn, about the neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, where bread was delivered fresh every morning. He told them about his brother Tommy, about how he had died at Omaha Beach, about the guilt Eddie carried for being safe while Tommy fought. "I used to think my work here did not matter," Eddie said quietly. "I wanted to be a soldier, a real soldier. But my captain told me something that stuck with me. He said that armies march on their stomachs, that feeding people is how you keep them human, how you remind them what they are fighting for." He looked at the German prisoners around the table. "I do not know if that is true, but I know that when I see you guys eat what I make, when I see it matter to you, I feel like maybe I am doing something worthwhile after all." Klaus kneaded a portion of dough, his hands working the elastic mixture, and realized that for the first time since his capture, he was not thinking about hunger or guilt or war. He was simply making bread with other men who understood the quiet dignity of the craft. If the donuts had surprised the German prisoners, the American relationship with coffee baffled them completely. Klaus watched in amazement as guards poured themselves cup after cup throughout the day, drinking the dark brew constantly, casually, as if it were water. In Germany, coffee had become a precious commodity early in the war, replaced by substitutes made from roasted grain or chicory that bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing. A single cup of genuine coffee was something to be savored slowly, rationed carefully, shared reluctantly. But here, enormous pots of coffee sat on warmers in the mess hall all day long. Prisoners could help themselves freely, as often as they wanted. Klaus had watched one American guard, Sergeant Bill Thompson from Tennessee, drink at least 10 cups during a single shift. When the pot ran low, someone simply made more, dumping out what remained rather than saving it for later. The waste was incomprehensible. Werner had calculated that the camp probably threw away more coffee grounds in a week than his entire unit had received in a month during the final stages of the war. Corporal Peterson noticed Klaus staring at him as he poured his fourth cup of the morning. "You want some?" Peterson asked, gesturing to the pot. Klaus already had a half-full cup, but he nodded, curious about the American's casual attitude. Peterson topped off Klaus's cup, then leaned against the wall, cradling his own mug. "My pa used to say that coffee is what separates civilization from chaos," Peterson said, through a combination of simple English and hand gestures that Klaus was beginning to understand. "Start the day with good coffee, everything else falls into place." Eddie Walsh joined them, carrying his own perpetually full cup. Through Peterson, he explained the American coffee culture that the prisoners found so alien. "Back home, diners stay open all night just serving coffee," Eddie said. "People meet for coffee, do business over coffee, solve problems with coffee. It is not just a drink. It is how we connect with each other." He tried to explain the concept of a coffee break, a designated time during work when everything stopped just to drink coffee and talk. The German prisoners struggled to grasp this idea. During the war, breaks were rare, luxuries that could not be afforded when production was everything. Helmut observed, "In Germany, we have Kaffee und Kuchen, coffee and cake, but that is for special occasions, Sundays, celebrations. Not every day, and certainly not all day long." Eddie nodded, beginning to understand the cultural gap. "Here, it is every day, multiple times a day, for everyone." He gestured around the camp. "Private, sergeant, officer, does not matter. Everyone drinks the same coffee, as much as they want." This detail struck Klaus forcefully. In the Wehrmacht, rank determined everything, including access to better rations. Officers ate well, while enlisted men scraped by. But here, the lowest-ranking American private drank from the same coffee pot as the camp commander. The egalitarianism was as foreign as the abundance. That evening, Klaus wrote in a small notebook he had been given, "They drink coffee like we drink water, they waste more than we ever had. And somehow, this makes me understand why we lost more than any battle report ever could." November 2, 1945. The Red Cross delivered the first batch of letters from Germany to Camp Concordia. 23 letters for 37 prisoners. The envelopes thin and worn from their journey across the Atlantic. Camp Commander Major Robert Stevens personally handed them out in the mess hall after breakfast, understanding the weight of what he carried. Klaus received 2 letters, both from Maria. His hands shook as he opened the first one, dated August 12, written just weeks before his capture. Maria's handwriting was shaky, written in pencil because ink had become impossible to find. "My dearest Klaus," she began, "I pray this letter finds you alive and safe. Hamburg is gone. I do not mean damaged, I mean gone. Our neighborhood no longer exists. The bakery where we bought Anna's birthday cake is rubble. The church where we married is a shell with no roof. I am writing this from the cellar of what used to be the Hoffman's building. We are 12 families living in spaces meant for storing potatoes." Klaus read on, his vision blurring. Maria described a city of women, children, and old men picking through ruins. She wrote about a diet of cabbage soup, potato peels when they could be found, and bread that was more sawdust than flour. She mentioned Anna and little Sophie by name, describing how they had learned to catch rats in the cellar, how they traded cigarettes Klaus had sent for food on the black market, how Sophie had forgotten what chocolate tasted like. "The girls ask about you constantly," Maria wrote. "I tell them you are alive, that you will come home when you can. But Klaus, I do not know what home means anymore. There is nothing left of the life we knew. When you return, if you return, we will have to build everything from nothing." The second letter was dated September 29, 3 weeks after his capture. Maria's tone was more desperate. "Food is becoming impossible. The occupation authorities provide rations, but they are barely enough to survive. We stand in lines for hours for a loaf of bread that would not have fed us for a single meal before the war. Anna is so thin, Klaus. I can count her ribs. She cries from hunger at night, and I have nothing to give her." Klaus set the letters down on the mess hall table next to the half-eaten donut from breakfast. The contrast was obscene, Maria describing Anna crying from hunger, while Klaus sat surrounded by more food than he could eat. Werner had received 1 letter from his mother. He read it silently, then stood abruptly and walked out of the mess hall, his face twisted with anguish. Friedrich received no letters at all, which might have been worse than bad news. At least the others knew their families were alive, suffering but surviving. Friedrich had only silence and uncertainty. That afternoon, no one ate lunch. The American guards noticed, but said nothing. They simply covered the food and put it away, understanding that some grief could not coexist with eating. Private Eddie Walsh stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the prisoners sit in small clusters, holding their thin letters, and felt the inadequacy of donuts in the face of such vast suffering. For 3 days after the letters arrived, the German prisoners moved through the camp like ghosts. They ate mechanically when required, worked when assigned, but the light that had slowly been kindling in their eyes had extinguished. Klaus could not look at donuts without seeing Anna's thin face. Werner could not drink coffee without thinking of his mother's hunger. Even Helmut stopped coming to the kitchen, unable to reconcile his pleasure in baking with the knowledge of what his wife endured. On the morning of November 6th, Private Eddie Walsh made a decision. He found Corporal Peterson and asked him to bring Klaus, Werner, Friedrich, and Helmut to the kitchen. When the 4 Germans arrived, Eddie had already prepared the workspace. Flour, eggs, butter, and yeast lay measured on the counter. But today, he also had paper and pencils laid out. "I want to teach you something different today," Eddie said through Peterson's translation. "I want to teach you how to bake with almost nothing. Depression recipes. War recipes. The kind of bread my grandmother made when there was barely anything in the house." He could see their confusion, their uncertainty about whether this was kindness or cruelty. Eddie continued, "My family came to America with nothing. My grandmother used to tell stories about making bread from acorns when they could not afford wheat, about stretching 1 egg to feed 6 people, about creating something from scraps because giving up was not an option." He gestured to the ingredients. "This here, this abundance, this is not normal even in America. My grandmother lived through times when we had little, but she never stopped baking. She said that bread was hope made visible, that as long as you could make bread, you could survive anything." Helmut stepped forward slowly. "What are you saying?" he asked in careful English. Eddie looked him in the eye. I am saying write down these recipes, learn how to make bread with almost nothing. And when you go home, when you get back to your families, you will know how to feed them. You will have something to bring besides just yourself." The words hung in the kitchen air, and Klaus felt something shift inside his chest. Eddie was not just teaching them to bake. He was giving them a way to transform their guilt into action, their helplessness into skill. For the next 2 hours, Eddie taught them recipes his grandmother had developed during the hardest times. Bread made with potato water to stretch the flour, rolls that used less yeast but longer rising time, techniques for making small amounts of fat go further, ways to create sweetness without sugar, using beets or carrots or anything that could be found. Helmut took notes frantically, his baker's mind recognizing the genius in these adaptations. Klaus and Werner followed along, their hands learning motions that might someday feed their families. Friedrich, who had never baked in his life, worked with fierce concentration, as if memorizing these techniques could somehow reach across the ocean to help the mother he had not heard from. "This is how you turn guilt into something useful," Eddie said quietly. "You learn everything you can here, and you take it home. You make your suffering mean something by ending someone else's." December 10, 1945. The official announcement came during morning formation. Major Stevens stood before the assembled German prisoners and read from a document sent from Washington. Repatriation procedures would begin in January. The prisoners would be processed through staging camps and transported back to occupied Germany, where they would be released to Allied authorities and eventually allowed to return to their homes. What should have been received as joyful news landed like a heavy stone. Klaus looked around at the other prisoners and saw his own conflicted feelings reflected in their faces. They were going home, home to families they desperately missed, to a country they barely recognized, to cities that no longer existed. But they were going home as men who had been fed well, who had slept in warm beds, who had been treated with unexpected kindness by their enemies. How could they explain this to people who had suffered under Allied bombs, who had starved while occupation forces controlled what remained of their country, who had watched their children go hungry while German prisoners in America ate donuts for breakfast? That evening, the prisoners gathered in the barracks to discuss what they could not say to the Americans. Werner spoke first, his voice tight with anxiety. "My mother will ask me what it was like in the prison camp. She will expect stories of hardship, of cruelty, of suffering that matches her own. What do I tell her? That I gained weight? That I learned to make American coffee? That the enemy fed me better than our own army ever did?" Friedrich, who still had not heard from his family, added, "If anyone is even alive to ask, and if they are not, then I will have survived and eaten well while they died hungry. How do I live with that?" Helmut had been quiet, but now he pulled out the notebook where he had written all of Eddie's recipes. "We tell them the truth," he said firmly, "not to hurt them, but because these recipes, this knowledge, it can help them. It can help rebuild." He held up the notebook. "This is not just American techniques, this is survival. This is how to make bread when there is almost nothing. Eddie taught us this so we could help our families, not so we could feel guilty about learning it." Klaus thought about Maria's letters, about Anna's hunger, about the impossibility of bridging the gap between his experience and theirs. "But how do we explain that the Americans were kind?" he asked. "That they treated us like human beings when we were taught they would treat us like animals? How do we tell them that everything we believed was a lie?" Corporal Peterson, who had been standing near the door, spoke up. "You tell them the truth," he said in his improving German. "You tell them that people are more complicated than propaganda, that enemies can become friends. That is not a betrayal, that is hope." But as Klaus lay in his bunk that night, he wondered if hope would be enough to bridge the vast chasm between his full stomach and their empty ones. January 18, 1946. The final morning at Camp Concordia arrived with unexpected snow, rare for Kansas but fitting for the somber occasion. Klaus woke before dawn, unable to sleep, knowing that this was the last time he would wake in this strange place that had become simultaneously a prison and a sanctuary. The transport trucks would arrive at noon to take them to the port in New York, beginning their journey back across the Atlantic to a Germany they could barely imagine. Private Eddie Walsh had also arrived early, well before his usual 4 o'clock start time. He had spent the previous evening planning something special, though he struggled to define what special meant in this context. How do you mark the departure of enemy prisoners who had become something like friends? He decided to bake the best donuts he had ever made, using techniques that Helmut had taught him from the old German traditions, combined with his own American methods. A fusion of former enemies, made from flour and sugar. When the prisoners entered the mess hall for the last time, they found the tables arranged differently. Instead of the usual cafeteria-style seating, the tables had been pushed together to form one long surface, and American guards sat interspersed with German prisoners. At each place setting sat a donut, but also a small wrapped package. Major Stevens stood at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," he said, with Corporal Peterson translating, "this morning we share a final meal together. You came here as our enemies. You leave as men we have come to respect." Klaus sat between Werner and Corporal Peterson. He unwrapped the small package to find a handwritten copy of recipes, carefully transcribed in both English and German. Depression bread, potato rolls, stretching techniques. Every method Eddie had taught them, written out in clear instructions they could take home. Other prisoners opened identical packages, some with tears in their eyes at this final act of thoughtfulness. Eddie emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. He moved around the table, filling cups for Germans and Americans alike, his usual efficiency tempered with obvious emotion. Helmut stood slowly, clearing his throat. In careful English, he addressed the room. "Private Walsh, you taught me to bake again. You gave me back something I thought the war had taken from me. More than that, you showed me that craft, that the love of making good food, it crosses all the boundaries we create." He paused, struggling with vocabulary and emotion. "You showed me that feeding people is not about politics. It is about remembering we are all human." The breakfast proceeded with unusual quiet, men eating slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment itself. Klaus bit into his donut and tasted all the mornings that had come before, all the small kindnesses that had accumulated like snowflakes until they became something substantial enough to change how he understood the world. When the coffee was gone and the plates were empty, no one moved. They sat together, former enemies sharing a table, unwilling to break the spell that had transformed captivity into community. 27 years later, in the spring of 1973, Klaus Schneider stood in a small bakery in Hamburg, Germany. At 59 years old, he had rebuilt his life from the rubble of war. His wife Maria had survived, as had both daughters. Anna was now a mother herself, with children who had never known hunger, who could not imagine a world where bread was scarce or coffee was a luxury. The bakery Klaus operated with his son-in-law bore a sign painted in both German and English: Concordia Bakery, American and German Traditions. Behind the counter sat a display case filled with donuts. Not exactly like the ones Eddie Walsh had made in Kansas, but close enough that the smell transported Klaus back to that prison camp every single morning. He had returned to Germany in February of 1946, carrying his notebook of recipes and a heart full of confusion about what he had experienced. The reunion with Maria had been as complicated as he had feared. She had struggled to understand his stories about American kindness, about abundance in captivity, about learning to bake from the enemy. For months, perhaps years, there had been a distance between them, a gap created by different experiences of the same war. But the recipes had helped. Klaus had taught Maria the techniques Eddie had shown him, ways to stretch scarce ingredients, methods for creating sustenance from almost nothing. As Germany slowly rebuilt, as the Marshall Plan brought aid and the economic miracle began, those skills had evolved. Klaus had eventually opened a small bakery, then a larger one, building a business on the foundation of what he had learned in captivity. Werner Koch had visited last month, traveling from Munich, where he ran a successful cafe. They had sat in Klaus's bakery, drinking real coffee, eating donuts, and remembering those strange months when the world had turned upside down. Werner's mother had survived the war, living until 1968. She had never fully understood her son's stories about the American prison camp, but she had been grateful for the baking techniques that helped feed the family during the hardest years of Reconstruction. Helmut Braun had passed away in 1969, but before his death, he had published a small cookbook titled Bread from Two Worlds, combining German and American baking traditions. In the foreword, He had written about Private Eddie Walsh and the gift of remembering that even enemies share the basic human need to eat, to create, to nourish one another. Klaus had never managed to contact Eddie after the war, though he had tried through various channels. He did not know if the young American baker was still alive, still making donuts somewhere in Brooklyn, still teaching people that food could bridge the chasms that war created. But every morning when Klaus made his donuts, he thought of Eddie's words. Baking is honest work. You put good things in, you get good things out. A young customer entered the bakery, speaking German with an American accent. A student, perhaps, or a tourist. Klaus served him a donut and coffee, watching the young man's face light up with pleasure at the taste. Is good? Klaus asked in English. The young man nodded enthusiastically. It's perfect. Reminds me of home. Klaus smiled, understanding more than the student could know. Yes, he said quietly. That is exactly the point.